My name's Russell Spatz. I'm an alcoholic. I'm here for the donuts and coffee. That's the deal. They promised me, well, I want to thank you. I do appreciate it. They promised all the way up here. I'm saying to Raton, right? What's his face? I'll never forget what's his face. I'm saying, man, I can almost taste that coffee. You know, I mean, I can almost taste it, and and I came here and everybody's got like coffee and everything. I would say, what was it? 2 alkies promised me coffee and donuts, and I was almost disappointed. But then I remember I usually tell my sponsees, anybody who's ever disappointed by an alcoholic is sicker than the alcoholic is disappointed in me. You actually thought these people were going to show up? I mean, who told you that shit, you know? So this is on the 12 steps, and we're going to talk a little, I think we'll have a little fun. We weren't having any fun here, you know. I was just talking about Jesus or something, or just to try to see if I get somebody pissed off, and didn't work. But I think it may have worked on a couple. But in any event, so I went down to talk a little bit about service. Who am I? What am I doing? I haven't had a drink since January 25th, 1981. So I'm in my 25th year of sobriety. No, what am I?
45th.
45th year of sobriety. That's why I have Braden here, you know. In any event, so I'm going to talk about a few things about service and stuff like that, and which is going to lead into maybe what I'm doing now in my life now and how it is. So I was. At any event, so I was doing the steps after I had about 2 or 3 years. I was doing, I don't know what it was, 3 or 4 or 5 years. I was doing this stuff we do down here, which is really indigenous to South Florida. They don't have it anywhere else, as far as I know. I thought everybody had step series, but they have it down here. That's it. So I got on this thing in Dade and Broward County doing these step series, and I was doing a step series. I was relatively new doing this stuff, and of course I wanted to make sure I was doing the right thing. I used to come with the books, color coded and all that shit, you know. And there's nothing wrong with that. It's okay. But you know, and so I went out to the Homestead group, and I was down there at the Homestead group, and it had a bunch of, the room was filled and everything. I think I was doing, I don't know, I think I was doing the 3rd step or the 4th step. I was doing some step. It was, if you look at the Guinness Book of World Records, it's actually ranked as the worst AA meeting in the history of Alcoholics Anonymous. I don't think anybody's actually ever broken that record. It was absolutely terrible. It wasn't like you guys. Like every once in a while you guys chuckle or something, but it was like, I'm telling you, it was like an oil painting. Nobody was laughing. I could tell they didn't like me. Nobody laughed at any of my jokes. I wasn't going over anything. And it was like a terrible, terrible thing. And I said, and it was very embarrassing. And so I left. I said to myself, I said, I ain't going back there, because it was embarrassing. They obviously didn't like me, and I'm not going back there. But even as I'm saying to myself, I'm going to make an excuse. I mean, you know, because if you're an alcoholic, I'm an excuse-aholic. I mean, I'm sorry I couldn't make it next. My mother died, you know, the dog died, whatever it is. I had to shampoo the chicken, you know, whatever you come up, whatever floats your boat. And but I wasn't going to come back because it was embarrassing and they didn't like me, and you know, but I knew I was going to come back because I had this sponsor. I had these sponsors and people and mentors, and I don't know if they ever told me this, but I was absolutely sure they were big on service. And I'm talking about the days, you know, 45 years ago, we'd actually go out to people's houses, we'd grab them. You know, I'd take people to meetings and I'd pick up booze along the way so they wouldn't go in the DTs. And those are the days when we were doing wet work. You could actually go to an A meeting, there'd be a guy there drunk. You know, I mean, it's you say, well, what the fuck is he doing here? You know what I mean? An alcoholic, get him out of here, you know. Whatever. I guess you had to be there. But anyway, so that's what we did. Went to hospitals, we went to all these places, detoxes and everything. And that's how I was trained. That's what we did. That's what we did. We did that. And so I went down, I'm doing this thing. I said, I ain't going back there again. But I knew, like you somehow know certain things. I don't even know how I knew this. I knew that if I didn't go back, I'd drink. I don't know how. I don't know where that came from. I knew if I didn't keep my word, somehow, even after 4 or 5 years or whatever it is, I don't know how this happens. I saw a direct linkage in not fulfilling your responsibility and drinking. It wasn't, well, if I don't come, or maybe I'll feel better. It was like, I knew it was like the next step to not going back and keeping your word was right to the booze, And I believe that, which is, no, I don't think it's a bad thing. So I went back to, after I'd done the worst AA meeting in the history of Alcoholics Anonymous, I went back there again. And before I started meeting, I sat down and some guy came up to me and he said, this has something to do with the 12-step, by the way. And usually I don't get right into it, but I sort of try to wrap it up. So he comes up to me, he says, can I talk to you for a second? I said, sure. He says, listen, you don't know me, my name's Joe, or whatever it is. And he says, look, I just got to tell you, that meeting you did last week, he said, yeah, that saved my life. I said, it saved your life? That saved my life. He says, I had come home and my wife left me and she took my baby and I lost my job and said a couple other things and I was going to go drink. But what I did was instead of drinking, I figured I stopped in on the room. And you didn't see me, I was sitting all the way in the back of the room. But when you said the chicken was on the roof, the entire program came together for me. Changed my entire life. It was unbelievable. You saved my life. And I really want to thank you. And I said, well, I had never said the chicken was on the roof. You got it all wrong. I said the turkey was in the basement. I got the whole thing wrong. I took credit for it. I think it's the right thing to do. I said, oh yeah, chicken on the roof. Everybody knows, it's all over town. Everybody knows me by that statement. You know what I mean? And thank you. And as I was driving, I realized what the 12-step, I didn't realize what the 12-step was about. And all of a sudden I realized what it's about. I had gotten it all wrong. You see, I thought the 12-step was we carry this message to other alcoholics. How many people think the 12-step says we carry the message to other alcoholics? Anybody think that? That's what I thought. And then I realized that I had just done the worst meeting in the history of Alcoholics Anonymous. And as a result of doing the worst meeting in Alcoholics Anonymous, some guy had an epiphany and I saved his life because he heard me say something I didn't say. And all of a sudden I realized it doesn't say that we carried the message to other alcoholics. It says we tried to carry the message. We have nothing to do with it. And the one thing I did right in that meeting, the only thing I did right in that meeting is I did the best meeting I could do that night. It was the worst meeting, as it says in but it was the best meeting I could do that night. And what happened was, you see, I said turkey in the basement. And it flew across the room, all the way to the back of the room. And this guy is sitting there, and it goes into his ears, turkey in the basement, and God knows exactly what this guy needs to hear. God knows what he needs. He goes in and hears turkey in the basement, and he hears chicken on the roof. And I get the credit. And all I did was show up and do the worst meeting in the history of Alcoholics Anonymous. And apparently that's how it works. So, it doesn't matter if they all drink after the meeting. You just do the best job you can. That's it. That's still, God's in charge of this whole deal. So, in any event, I had these sponsors and people and mentors, and it was all about service and was all about service. These guys were crazy about service. You know, and I know some of this stuff you may have heard before, but bears repeating. Repetition doesn't matter. So I was like about a year sober, and I was broke, and I had a new wife, and I think we had a baby or something. I don't even know what the hell was going on. I had kids, and I had no money, and I'm driving around like in a big Cadillac, and I only have $50 for gas, and I had no money, and I didn't know where the money. I think I was about behind in the mortgage like 2 months or something. I was scared shitless. I didn't know what to do, and I'd wake up in the morning. I'd wake up at 3 o'clock in the morning, worry about this thing, and I go to sleep. You know, it was like bad. I was dying. You know, of anxiety, of fear, what's going to happen to me, so I should have told somebody, like my group, but I'm not gonna. Not that I give a shit what they think about me, but I'm not gonna tell those guys. What do they know? You know what I mean? And so I kept it to myself. You know what happens when you're scared and you keep it to yourself? It gets huge, you know, and it doesn't help at all. And because I was scared to tell anybody, because I had false pride, you know, and I wanted people to think that I was a big shot or something like whatever the hell alcoholics think when they keep things to themselves. And so it got so bad that my sponsor, Bob Sullivan at the time, I had to tell somebody because I was going nuts. And so I said to Bob, I said, can I talk to you? He said, sure. This is right before the meeting. He's setting up and everything. He's doing the coffee and everything. He's set up, and I'm talking. Can I talk? And I said, listen, you know, I don't know what's going on. He says, I said, I don't have any money. You know, I'm broke. I'm 2 months behind. I tell him the whole thing. He says, hey, don't even worry about it. I got that solved. We're going to solve that problem tonight. I said, really? He says, absolutely. I said, man, I got the greatest sponsor in the world. He's going to write me out a check for $1,000 or something, you know what I mean? And I'm getting all ready to receive the cash, you know? And look, AA is good, but I mean, we're talking money here, you know what I mean? I mean, there's nothing wrong with being spiritual, but I mean, you know, it's like money. It's not important. It's just right up there with oxygen, you know? And so he said, so I said, so how are we going to solve it? He says, I'm going to show you right here. He says, come on over here. He starts showing me how to make the coffee. And I'm thinking, now this is how we make the coffee and everything like that. And I'm thinking, I don't think I really explained myself well. You know what I mean? I think I could have been clearer on what the real problem was, you know. And he told me I was going to be making the coffee from now on. And believe me, it didn't escape me that he was the one who was making the coffee, you know what I mean? I mean, this is how they get out of making the coffee. They get the new guy to make it. And of course, I didn't understand how making coffee would help me at all. But anyway, so the next day, no money came in. And so nothing came in. So I was like depressed. You know, no, regular people get depressed. I was like very depressed, suicidal, you know what I mean? And I didn't want to go to the meeting. And because no money had come in, I was depressed. I didn't want to go to the meeting. But I had to go to the flipping meeting because I had to make the stupid coffee. Because if I didn't make the coffee, what are the people going to think about me? Not that I give a shit what people think about me. You understand what I'm saying? I'm working on a theory that alcoholics have like issues. They're messed up in their thinking, you know? So it's just a theory at this point. I haven't put the whole thing together. So in any event, I went and I made the coffee. I went to the meeting. And the next day I went to the meeting, I made the coffee. And I went to the meeting, I made the coffee, and 3 months went by and I was making coffee and the money came in and I was okay. And the money came in and some guy came up to me and he says, hey, I can make the coffee. I said, I'm the coffee maker. Who the hell pointing? Son of a bitch, you know what I mean? Get your own coffee cup, you know. So I'm the guy, you know, so that's how they get you into coffee.
Is it a long door, a white SUV?
White SUV. Okay, very good. Thank you. Thank you. That was disturbing me. I wanted to get disturbed. That was disturbable. Thank you. That's very kind of you. I was thinking, is anybody going to take charge here? You know. So so they told me to go do. So I've done. I don't want to say. I don't want to make it sound like bragging, but I have some like stories. You know, you get these stories. Not only is it funny, you get these stories. So I sponsored a guy named, my first real serious sponsee was Kevin. I loved Kevin. Kevin lived with us for a few months. I loved Kevin. I loved Kevin. Kevin had some issues. You know what I mean? He did. He had issues. He was a former recon Marine, you know, in the jungle and everything like that, all that sort of stuff. And a great guy, the funniest son of a bitch you'd ever seen in your life, you know. But he couldn't stop drinking. And that was the deal. He couldn't stop drinking. So Kevin, I would take him. He would never eat. He wouldn't eat. He wouldn't eat. I said, Kevin, do you want to eat? He says, okay, he'd eat. This is what he ate: coffee, a slice of toast, and a cigarette. That was pretty much his diet, you know, coffee, and he was depressed, and he'd be chain smoking and everything like that. And one day we were at a you know, like a Denny's or something like that, and he's talking to me about, you know, the same. It's always the same story. He was talking to me about how fucked up his life is and how depressed he is and everything like that. And he looked like he was about ready to commit suicide. And you know, you learn a lot by sponsoring people and working with people. You just learn a lot, you know, stuff, you know, and people are scared of sponsoring people, but you only learn by, you know, you can't break them. You can't. Alcoholics, they're like cockroaches. After a thermonuclear crash, the only thing that's left are cockroaches and alcoholics, you know. The alcoholics, haven't you ever heard of this? A guy head first into a car, kills a family of 4 and babies, and they don't even have a scratch, you know what I mean? They're just alkies, you can't hurt. What are you going to do? It's not going to hurt them. They'll go out and drink, you know, it's not going to kill them. You know, well, maybe it might kill them. So what's the big deal? Alkies were about as common as dirt. But in any event, so this guy, so he's sitting there talking to me about how suicidal he is and all that sort of stuff. And one guy called me up on the phone once. He says, I'm in Poughkeepsie. I'm going to kill myself. And I said, why in Poughkeepsie? Why would you do that in Poughkeepsie? I didn't understand, you know. Maybe it was Poughkeepsie that actually caused it. I didn't know. So I said to Kevin, so he said he was all bummed out and he was going to commit suicide. And I said, are you hungry? He said, no, I'm not hungry. I said, well, why don't you order some soup? Get some soup. I'll order some soup. So you got some soup, you got the soup, you got the toast. And he says, and then this happened, and that happened, and he starts eating his soup. And I said, and he's looking like he's going to kill himself, and he's eating his soup. And I said, Kevin, let me ask you something. He said, what? How's the soup? And he looked at me, he started laughing. He says, it's great. So, yeah, soup's good, isn't it? You know, you think we have some sort of massive, like, psychological fucking problems. You know what I mean? Sometimes you just need to get some sleep. Or see, alcoholics, they don't know how to sleep. They don't know how to eat. They don't know how to dress themselves. They don't know anything. Sometimes just say, yeah, just have some soup, you know, and that solves the entire fucking problem. You understand what I'm saying? I mean, you wouldn't know. This is endless. I'm not bullshitting you. You think you got to send them to a psychiatrist, you know, get pills for me? It's just chicken soup. You know, the soup is good. Soup's good. You know what I mean? So Kevin, I got a couple of Kevin stories. Good stories. God bless him. May you rest in, you know. So Kevin, what would happen with Kevin? He had like women issues. But anyway, he did. He had to, because he would sober up, and he was a funny guy. He had a great personality, and some woman would snatch him in AA. It was usually somebody, like he'd have like 3 days, and the gal would have like 13 months or something, you know what I mean? And next thing you know, he's living with her, you know? So, he'd be living with her. So he called me up, he says, Russell, he says, what? He says, so I was living with this gal, I'm not gonna give her name. Joanne, let's say. Living with Joanne, you know, it wasn't Joe. But he says, Russell, he says, what? I said, what, Kevin? He said, listen, he said, last night, Joanne tried to stab me in my back while I was falling asleep with scissors. And he says, yeah, that's not all. He says, I was talking to somebody on the phone. That was when we had phone lines. Do you remember when you had phone? On the phone. And she cut the phone line. She said, Roxanne's like, you don't know what that's like, Roxanne, do you? Yeah. Maybe her name was Roxanne. I'm not sure. But anyway, I can't remember exactly. No, it wasn't Roxanne. It could have been Roxanne, you know. But it wasn't Roxanne because he was still alive. But anyway, so I know that for sure. So what happened was, I said to Kevin, you know, the sponsor, I said, you know, Kevin, I'm thinking that when a woman tries to stab you in the back with scissors, that's like God's way of telling you that it's time to move out. And I wasn't even sober that long, and I figured that out, you know what I mean? And I don't even think that's in the big book. This is like an original, you know, in me, you know? And he said to me, this is what he said to me, he said, Russell, what about love? What about second chances? Don't we give people second chances? What about tolerance? What about kindness? Did I tell you that Kevin was a salesman? He said, what about this and what about that? And before 5 minutes into this thing, I'm starting thinking, well, maybe I am overreacting. You know what I mean? Maybe I should go to Al-Anon and get fixed or something. Maybe I'm like jumped to conclusions. Yeah, of course we love and second chance. And like a week later, he was drunk. You know what I mean? That was the end of that, you know? So he got sober again. Kevin got sober again. So he's sober what happened was, let me tell you how he got sober. He tried to punch a cop, and they sentenced him to Avon Park, like 90 days or 6 months in Avon Park. There's a prison for alkies. And they also have a girls' wing, a female alkies wing. Or I guess a female. Now, I don't know how the deal is, but somehow he was there he did his 3 months, and this other gal, I forgot her name, Annie said, you tell me, she says, this girl's gorgeous, everything. She did her 3 months, and they kicked him out, like beforehand, because they were fraternizing, you know, because that's what Kevin did. He'd get 3 months, and they fraternized with some gal, and they set up a house together. So I was going up to Tampa to go to Burns Steakhouse with my wife, and I said, well, Kevin, why don't you meet us over at Burns Steakhouse, you know, tonight, and I'll buy you dinner, and, you know, we'll meet Annie and all that sort of stuff. And so we're waiting there at Burns Steakhouse, and he didn't show up, you know, so I was a little worried about him. So I said, I called up and I said, yeah, Kevin, we're here at Burns Steakhouse, you're not here. He says, Russell, he says, you wouldn't believe what's going on. I said, what's the matter? He says, Annie. I said, what about Annie? He says, well, I'm here in the apartment. And down Annie's in the balcony. I said, yeah. And I'd hear this screaming. And I said, what's she doing? I said, well, she's nude. She's naked. I said, yeah. And she's got a butcher knife in her hand. I said, yeah. And she's got a bottle of vodka in her hand. And I said, yeah. And I said, what is she screaming? He says, she's screaming, get out. So I say, Kevin. He says, what? I said, I want you to listen to me. I want you to listen to this. He says, what is she? She's screaming, get out. I said, this is what I want you to do. I think you need to leave. You don't really have to be brilliant with this shit. Let me tell you, you get sponsored. I said, I think you have to leave. And he says, but what about love? What about tolerance? What if she hurts herself? I said, what is she doing now? She's screaming. She keeps on screaming, leave. I said, Kevin, you need to leave. You know? So he drank again, wound up in jail again. And eventually, he got sober or something. He was living up here. I think he sponsored a few guys. He's a great guy. And then, unfortunately, he got some sort of sickness and passed away. And so you can have a lot of fun. You don't want to miss any of this stuff. And so we had Relay down here. You know what Relay is? Relay is you volunteer for Relay, and you're on the phones. And what happens is my deal was every Friday night from 8 o'clock at night until 9 o'clock or 8 o'clock the next morning on a Friday night till Saturday morning. If you called up Alcoholics Anonymous, you got me. And I did that for 8 years. And so for an 8-year period of time, nobody got sober. Nobody got sober. You know? Nobody. Well, it's an interesting experience. You start off and you want to save everybody, and they pick up the phone, they start talking to you, and it's 3 o'clock in the morning, and you're talking to them until, like till 4 or 5 in the morning, and then they say something like, could you hold on for a second? I said, sure, and then you hear a glass, and you hear clink, clink, like the ice cream. And then after 2 hours of listening to, this is the way it sounds like. They talk, and then you interrupt for a second. Well, he says, no. You got to hear this. You got to hear you got to hear the rest of this. So for 2 hours, you're listening to the story, and they're filling up their, and they're lonely, they want someone to talk to. And then you say to them, finally, when they take a breath, you say, so now about this drinking thing, I don't want to quit drinking, I just wanted somebody to drink with me or talk to me or something like that. And so after you lose about a lot of sleep, you let them rattle on for like about 30 seconds and you say, let me ask something, you want to stop drinking? And if the answer is not absolutely, as a matter of fact, the greatest call you could ever get is one night, every once in a while I got it, but one night I remember I got this one call and the guy said, he says, I need help, I can't stop drinking. And he shut the fuck up. You know why? He was waiting to hear what I was going to say to him because he wanted help and he was going to do whatever I told him to do. And I said, this is what you do, buddy. You're going to be okay. I want you to meet me at the Sunset Room tomorrow at 11 o'clock for the meeting. We have a meeting. I'm going to be there and blah, blah, blah. And he'd be there. You're actually supposed to give it to somebody else, but I'm a sponsee whore. I grab them for myself. Screw the other people. I don't care. Let them die. Who cares? This is my guy. You know what I mean? And that's what I would do. And one night I got a call from a gal, and she says, "My name's Joanne." I'll use Joanne again. She says, "I'm a PhD in nursing." I didn't even know you can have a PhD in nursing. Did you know that, Roxanne? You're a nurse, aren't you? Yeah, I'm a PhD in nursing. And I'm being watched over by PRN. PRN is what happens if you're a nurse and you get in trouble with drugs or alcohol. You got this PRN, they watch over you, and they got a whole thing, and you can't drink, and they drug test you and everything like that. And he says, and I'm a single mother. And he says, and I'm really worried. I'm really worried because I don't want to drink and what happened is yesterday I took a drink. And I'm really worried because if they find out I drank, I'll lose my job and they'll take my daughter away. So, oh yeah, that's serious. He says, so if you could help me and tell me what to do to stop drinking, I really appreciate it. Or to make sure it doesn't happen again. He says, okay. He says, but there's only one thing. Only one thing. I said, what's that? He says, I don't want to hear anything about Alcoholics Anonymous. I said, well, we got two problems. Two problems. So what are the problems? I said, well, I'm 7 years sober in Alcoholics Anonymous. And that's how I got sober. And I don't even know what Plan B is, because that's the only thing I know. And she said, oh, okay, I understand that. And he says, so what's the second problem? I said, well, the second problem is you called Alcoholics Anonymous. This PhD in nursing. Nobody said alcoholics aren't bright, you know what I mean? We're pretty smart, we're pretty sharp. Yeah, you know, it's a tough deal, you know, being in Alcoholics Anonymous. So, I mean, I got a gazillion stories like that. And they're real. I mean, you don't want to miss this deal. It's the greatest show on earth, you know what I mean? I'd rather do this than it. As a matter of fact, this is all I do, you know, meetings, all I do is meetings. And then you get to help people. It's great. Then you get addicted to it. You do, you get addicted to helping people. I'm addicted to it. You know, at first you do it because somebody tells you, if you buy into that, nothing more ensures sobriety than intensive work with alcoholics. So, and that's sort of true for a while, but if you don't do some other things, there's some other stuff. There's another thing you got to get involved in. And you see, just working and helping people out, well, it's like a Band-Aid. It'll stop you from drinking for a while, but even there will reach a point in time where the worldly clamors will block out his presence if he was even there in the first place, and you'll drink anyway. Because what happens is the world's too big, there's too many moving parts, and you'll get cancer, or the IRS will take your money, or your wife or husband will leave, or something will go your way, and all of a sudden you'll miss that meeting, or you won't pick up that guy, you won't go to the hospital, something will happen, it'll get to you and you'll get very depressed. Or something, whatever, it'll happen, and you'll end up, it won't work for you. I mean, it's hard to believe that somebody who stayed sober for 5 or 10 or 15 years, doing all that stuff, and maybe doing everything perfectly in AA, or what you think perfectly is, all the work, working all the tools. Hard to believe that someone like that could actually drink after 20 years, or drink after 15 years. But most do. Most do. You know, you don't realize that as you're coming up, because it's like everybody's sober. You go to these conventions, it's 50,000 people and everything like that. But you see what happened, every once in a while you see, well, I had 10 years and then I drank, I had 20 years and then I drank, I had 5 years and then I drank, I had 6 months. You don't keep track of that. You just know what's happening. But, you know, what happens is when you get into your like 30s or 40s, that kind of stuff, what happens, and you sort of look at the deal. You look at the whole deal, you know what I mean? Like, and you go to these conventions, they do these things called countdowns. Anybody ever see a countdown? And what happens is you see that there's a gazillion people that have 8 years, 7 years, 5 years, 3 years, 2 years, 14 years, 15 years. And then it gets past like 20, and it's like you could shoot deer and not hit anybody. You know, there's one guy with 25, and there's a guy with 28, a guy with 34. There's one guy with 40, and then there's the guy with 50 who gives the book to the new guy. There's like 6 people. From 20 years to like 40, 50 years, there's like 6 or 7 people. And there's like 150, 200 people before that. And you realize that, and get this, then you start getting calls. Because when you get up there a little bit, what happens is, because, you know, if you got 10 or 15 years, you're not going to get a call from a guy with 25 years saying he wants to kill himself. You're probably not going to get that call. But if you got like 30 or 40 years, you'll get calls from people, or people bump into you. I have 30 years, they'll ask you to be their sponsor. They're miserable. And they'll start talking to you with 30 years of working the program. I mean, it's not like they don't know how to do the 4th step. It's not like they don't know how to do the 5th step. It's not like they don't do, it's not even that they don't believe. They'll start talking to you, and the manner in which they're talking, the things that are upsetting them, you know, don't take yourself too seriously. They're taking themselves seriously. You know, they're going, you're at 33 RPM. I forgot, a lot of you guys are young. You don't even know what I'm talking about. Well, the old timers will. You're talking at 33 RPM, they're like at 78. You know, they're like a machine gun. And you realize you got a guy there that's got 25 or 30 years, and he's acting and talking like he's got 3 months. I mean, I know guys that got 3 months, and they're doing better than you. And you realize that you could be sober for many years and be not be rocked in the fourth dimension of existence, not experience much of heaven, and certainly not knowing peace. And then you realize what's missing, and it ain't the fourth step. Hey, listen, the steps are great tools. They're tools to get you somewhere. You know, they're tools to get you. You know what they're tools are. It says there's one who has all power. That one is God, may you find him now. The steps are tools to get to him. You know, the 12, you see, you can have the 12 steps. You can have the 12 down perfectly. You know, Bill Wilson had all 12 steps perfect. He wrote the book. But at 23 years sober, he was very depressed. And he didn't know what the problem was because he founded AA. And you know what the problem was? Because he tells you what the problem was. He knew all the 12 steps, but he knew all the 12, but he didn't know the one. You see, you know, you can know all 12 and do all 12 and not know the one. You know, but nothing. You can have gratitude, and that gratitude can fade if you don't have worship. You know, and you can tell yourself you believe in God, but if he's not the central fact of your life, you don't have worship. You know, you can tell yourself, yeah, you can hold hands, you know, and say the Lord's Prayer and all that stuff. You can do all that stuff, you know, and act like you know God and all that sort of stuff, and believe it. But if you don't wake up in the morning thinking about him, and you don't go to bed thinking about him, and all during the day thinking about him, and all you want to do is talk about him, because it's the most important thing in your life, then you don't have worship. He's not the central fact of your life. And the problem is, to the extent that you're not thinking about him, the worldly clamors, you know what Bill Wilson said? When he first had that amazing experience, remember what he said? He said, the Lord has been so wonderful to me, curing me of this terrible disease that I got to keep talking about it and telling other people. That's what Bill Wilson said in Alcoholics Anonymous number 3 to build, I think it was to Bill Dotson, you know, and Bill Dotson said, I was sober, but I knew there was something more, something I didn't have, some sort of release, some sort of happiness, and I didn't know what it was. And then Bill was in my house one day with my wife, Henrietta, and he said this line. He said, they call it in AA the golden text. They even have a name for it, the golden. He says, the Lord, that's a Jesus thing, by the way. Because back then, that was before the traditions and the Nazis took over. And you could say shit like that. You understand what I'm saying? I'm talking about that time between 1935 and 1939. Remember that time? That's a time. In the big book, they say, rarely have we seen a person fail who has thoroughly, that's a sentence. Sentences are important. Thoroughly followed our path. The path they were talking about is what they were doing between 1935 and 1939. The big book was published and written by Bill Wilson in 1939. So the path they were on had really nothing to do with the big book. The first AA meeting was Dr. Bob putting his foot on the dining room chair and reading the Sermon on the Mount, Matthew 5, 6, and 7. Dr. Bob says, in Dr. Bob and the Good Old Timers, the books that we found absolutely essential were 1 Corinthians 13, Sermon on the Mount, the book of James. That's the time, remember, when Ann Smith, every morning they would have a Bible reading, or from the upper room or something like that, and you couldn't get into an AA meeting. You remember, between 1935 and 1939, you couldn't get into an AA meeting unless you got down on your knees and gave your life to God. You remember that time, don't you? Oh, no, you don't remember that time because you don't do that stuff anymore. So that's the time when Bob Smith went to Clarence, the brewmaster, in the hospital, and he was 135 pounds, this is in Dr. Bob, Good Old Timers. If you ever actually get past the big book that was written when he had 33 years and you get into some other literature. So Dr. Bob went to see Clarence, the brewmaster. He was 35 years old. He was in the hospital. And the first question he asked him was, do you believe in God? First question, do you believe in God? And Clarence says, what does that have to do with it? And Bob Smith says, everything. Well, I guess I do. Well, Bob could have been satisfied with that. But you know what Bob Smith, he says, guess nothing. There's no middle of the road shit here. You either do or you don't. He says, I do. Good. Get down out of the hospital bed and get on your knees. You're going to pray. He says, I don't know how to pray. That's okay. You just do what I tell you to do. And he did. And that's when Clarence says that great line. He says, I did what I was ordered to do. There were no suggestions. So when you hear that, so you see, if you understand the sentences and you understand what they were doing, and instead of making believe you know what AA is all about, you actually read the shit and get into it and know exactly what they're doing, then you may realize that when the book says, rarely have we seen a person fail who has thoroughly followed our path, then you'll realize what their path was, and that you have to thoroughly follow it. Otherwise, you're just not living a life of rigorous honesty. You're just bullshitting yourself. And then you'll understand why very few people make it past 20 years. Then you'll have a different vision of AA and why this is happening. And you'll understand that it has to do, that all the things we do, the 4 steps, they're all necessary, they're all important. Look, many times I'll say to somebody, you need to do an inventory on that. You need to do a fist, but the truth of the matter is, you can do all that stuff. It's like being in prison, like an AA prison, AA coffin, do all that stuff in AA, and you can still drink. Because you want to know something? It hasn't changed you to the point where you've got the one thing, which is the only thing. And if you read the last page of the big book, it says, but we won't know you. He says, we can't be sure of that. God will determine that, because your real reliance has to be on him. When you start reading the sentences, they mean something. And then he says, see to it your relationship with him is right. People talk about being spiritual. Spiritual is rarely talked about in the big book, where right in the same sentence or the next sentence, they're not talking about God. They're not talking about God. And in AA, if you go into an AA room sometimes, you could walk through an AA room for an hour and people talk about all the problems. You won't hear one person talk about God. Let's say like HP or something like that. It's almost like they're allergic to the word because they don't want people not to like them. Because unfortunately what happened with the traditions is that a lot of people use the traditions to seal the lid on the AA coffin and to keep you to a certain place where you never leave that place. And Bill Wilson started understanding that when he had 23 years sobriety and he almost drank again. And he said that there were some people that were really way beyond the traditions and everything else. He called them the benighted ones. He said, perhaps they will be the spearhead for the next major development in AA. Don't let, the traditions, they're good. There's nothing wrong with them. The tradition, but you want some? I don't worship the traditions. And the fellowship is not like the God of my understanding. Neither is my sponsor or Bill Wilson or anybody else. Even Dr. Bob knew that. He said to Bill Wilson, last words, he said, let's not screw this thing up. Let's keep it simple. And if you really do this AA thing good, and you get a hold of the one that has all power, you want to know something? You got a hold. You might find yourself in a different AA. You might actually find yourself in AA, but a different AA. You know, one guy came to one of our meetings. We have a workshop on Saturdays. I go to there every Saturday, and it's 5 hours. We would get 80 people from all over the world. You know, and we talk about faith logs. We talk about God. We have people that all sorts of time, and that kind of stuff. You may find, and some guy came to me, he says, well, wait a second, well, does this violate the tradition? He says, I thought this was AA. I said, this is AA. It's just not your AA. It may not be your AA. You're welcome here, but this is AA. This is our AA. This is how we do AA. And we do meetings like that all the time. And people, so we get people that have like 3 days and they never leave. Next thing you know, they got 3 years. And if you talk to them, they sound like they have 25 years. It's a different kind of deal. It's the kind of deal that was going on between 1935 and 1939. There's no middle of the road solution. There's no half measures. It's the fellowship of the Spirit. It's not the fellowship of the problem. One guy once told me about the crabs. I tell people about the crabs, a bucket of crabs. If you go crabbing, he said, if you go, I'm not a crabber, I don't go crabbing, but if you go crabbing, you throw a crab into a bucket, he says, how you keep a crab in a bucket? Because the crab will start trying to crawl out of the bucket. He says, you're throwing another crab. Because when you throw in the second crab, the first crab will try to crawl out. But the second crab will grab onto the first crab and bring him back in. And if you start talking about God too much in an AA meeting, what'll happen is, one of the crabs will grab you and tell you you're killing newcomers. That's what they'll tell you. They'll tell you you're killing newcomers, They'll grab you right back into that AA bucket, you know what I mean? But if you say you're an atheist or you don't believe in God, they'll have you chair the frickin' meeting. That doesn't bother their ass at all, you know what I mean? Even though the big book says this sort of thinking must be abandoned, they'll let a newcomer hear a guy with 10 years saying, I don't believe in God, so you could be thoroughly confused about what we're about, even though the book does nothing but mention God. But if you talk about God, they'll tell you you're screwing newcomers, so you feel guilty. You gotta be very careful around here because this isn't Well People's Anonymous, you know what I mean? Really? There's some issues going on, so. Well, that's all I have. God bless you guys.